ill-fated 1848 Franklin expedition were located. Archaeologists in northern Greece unearthed an enormous burial mound, the final resting place probably not of Alexander the Great, but possibly of his companion Hephaestion. Mahendraparvata, the first Khmer capital, thought to have been the largest settlement of the Middle Ages, was discovered close to the Angkor Wat temple complex in Cambodia. Archaeologists working in the necropolis of Saqqara happened upon a mummification workshop. In the Cygnus constellation, 1,400 light-years from our sun, a celestial body was found in a so-called habitable zone, on which the average temperature is similar to that of Earth, meaning there may be or may once have been water there, and hence also life, such as we imagine life to be. Preface. On an August day a few years ago, I visited a town in the north. It lies on one of the innermost bays of a marine inlet that has extended far into the interior of the land since a prehistoric ice age, and whose brackish water is home in spring to herring, in summer to eels, in autumn to cod, and in winter to carp, pike, and brim. Hence fishermen ply their trade there to this day. For centuries, these men and their families have lived in a neighborhood that can only be described as quaint, consisting of little more than 2 cobbled streets, a drying place for the nets, and a monastery now occupied only by 2 aristocratic old ladies. In short, it is one of those seemingly timeless places that might very well tempt one to believe that some bygone age as vague as it is appealing is still alive today. Yet it was not the flowering rose bushes and leggy hollyhocks in front of the squat, whitewashed houses, nor their brightly painted wooden doors or the narrow alleys between the buildings, most of them leading straight down to the stony shore, that particularly lodged in my memory, but rather the peculiar fact that in the village center, instead of a market square, I found a graveyard, shaded by the green foliage of young lime trees and enclosed by cast-iron railings. In other words, the fact that, in the place where normally goods would be exchanged for money, instead the dead and buried were doing what, out of entrenched wishful thinking, is generally termed resting in peace. My astonishment, which I initially took for unease, was considerable, and was further compounded when someone pointed out to me the house of a woman who, while she cooked, was able to look out from her kitchen upon the grave of her prematurely deceased son, and it became clear to me that the centuries-old tradition of the guild that takes care of the funeral rites here had resulted in the dead and living of the same family ending up in the kind of close proximity I had previously only heard of in the case of the inhabitants of certain Pacific islands. Of course, I had visited other notable burial sites before, the cemetery island of San Michele, for instance, which, with its high red brick walls, looms up out of the turquoise water of the lagoon of Venice like an impenetrable fortress, or the garish stalls in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery to mark the Dia de los Muertos, celebrated annually by the Mexican people, with graves decked out in orange and yellow, and skulls made from brightly colored sugar and papier-mâché, doomed by their advanced state of decay to grin in perpetuity. Yet none touched me as deeply as the fishing community's cemetery, whose peculiar shape, a kind of compromise between a circle and a square, struck me as the very emblem of the remarkable utopia I saw embodied there, a life where death was always in view. For a long time I was convinced that in this place, whose Danish name means small island or surrounded by water, one is closer to life, precisely because its inhabitants had literally brought the dead into their midst instead of, as is otherwise the norm in our latitudes, banishing them from the heart of the community to beyond the city gates, although these burials